Hello and welcome to our panel on the US elections, co-organized by the Center of the Study of Democratic Institutions at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, the UBC Political Science Department, and the Canadian International Council. My name is Kazi Mohua. I'm a graduate student at School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC. Just a brief information about my background. I've mostly worked as a development professional in the United Nations globally and also contributed towards journalism in the later part of my career, which actually made me interested towards policy. On a lighter note, I have worked in the Fox News in the USA for a while. And if you have watched Fox News, like shows like Fox and Friends in the Fox News recently, you surely know why today's discussion is very important. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples on which Vancouver residents live, work, and study. Just a quick housekeeping notes for our session today, which you'll see in the chat as well. Please note that we are recording the session and we'll be posting the video on our website. We are leaving the chat open and activity in the chat will not be recorded. You can post questions to the chat, or you can also direct them to our Q&A moderator, Rebecca Moderate, who will either call on you to unmute yourself or state your question, or she can state it on your behalf, depending on what you want to do. And please be mindful and respectful during the session and in the chat. As we know, the 2020 US election is less than a month away, but the coronavirus pandemic has thrown many aspects of the race into uncertainty. Voters in the US will decide on November 3rd whether Donald Trump remains in the White House. The Republican president is being challenged by Democratic Party nominee Joe Biden, who is best known as Obama's vice president, but has been in the US politics since the 1970s. If you want to freshen your memory on the election info, debates, who's running in which state, or even how to vote, this website can be very beneficial. That is www.ballotpedia.org. You'll have it in the chat as well. Also, as election day approaches, polling companies will be trying to gauge the nation's mood by asking voters which candidate they prefer. You can keep track of those polls here and try to work out what they can and can't tell you about who will win the election. This website is www.projects530.com. You'll see in the chat as well. And most importantly, make informed decision by only selecting your authentic information sources for years. Misinformation and disinformation could hurt your knowledge. It is my pleasure to introduce you to today's moderator, Professor Lisa Sundstrom. Professor Sundstrom is an associate professor of political science and co-chair of the International Relations program at UBC and teaches international relations and comparative politics. Her primary research interests include democratization, human rights, gender politics, the politics of international democracy assistance, and NGO activism. Dr. Sundstrom's latest book is Courting Gender Justice, Russia, Turkey, and the European Court of Human Rights. Over to you, Dr. Sundstrom.
Thank you very much, Kazi, and welcome everyone. It's great to have you join us this afternoon. There are certainly lots of questions surrounding this election, and to use a cliche at this point, it is unprecedented in so many ways. Now, one note before we start, we realize that as we're kicking off this series about the US election, which is a fairly testosterone-laden campaign season, we're kicking it off with a manel. And while we realize that we make our best efforts to organize panels to strike some gender balance and diversity in them, we acknowledge that we don't always succeed in accomplishing that. However, thankfully, our excellent panelists today are very attuned to their own positions in these dynamics and the reasons why this panel might not be as diverse as it should be. Today, in the first of several events that we're holding around the US elections, we'll hear about the dynamics of the campaigns, the impacts that protests against racialized violence and police brutality have had on the election, about voter suppression and intimidation, and the many legal and political questions that are surrounding the possibility of having a contested election after November 3rd. So I'll introduce you now to our speakers. First, we have Richard Johnston. Richard Johnston is a professor emeritus of political science here at UBC. His distinguished career includes appointments at the University of Toronto, UPenn, Caltech, and Harvard, in addition to his long service at UBC. He held the Canada Research Chair in Public Opinion, Elections, and Representation until his retirement in June 2020. Dr. Johnston has done extensive research on electoral and party systems, communications media and campaigns, and social capital, diversity, and the welfare state. We're really lucky to have him because he always has a lot of extremely interesting and important things to say about elections. Second, we have Bruce Baum, who's an associate professor of political science at UBC. He works in modern and contemporary political theory. His primary research and teaching interests are in the areas of critical social theory, including critical race and feminist theory, American political thought and cultural politics, the political theories of Mill and Marx, philosophy of political inquiry, and liberal and democratic theory. His current project underway is tentatively titled Identities and Indignities: Critical Theory and the Politics of Equality, Identity, and Difference. Finally, we have Robert Russo, who's a faculty lead lecturer for the LLMCL program at the Peter Allard School of Law here at UBC. Dr. Russo's interests include human rights, labor, and justice issues in law. His research has been primarily in the area of immigration and labor and employment law, and he has published several peer-reviewed articles in this field. He's an active member in the local legal community and a member of the Law Society of British Columbia. Each of our panelists will take several minutes to provide us first with their initial reflections. Then I'll spend some time posing questions to them, and we'll leave about the last 20 minutes of the session open to questions from the audience. So please remember to send Rebecca your questions. You can send her a direct message privately in the chat, and she will help moderate the final audience question and answers that are selected. So with that, without further ado, I'll hand it over to our first speaker, Richard Johnston. Go ahead, please, Dick.
Thanks, Lisa. I noticed the emphasis on long service. I guess if the shoe fits. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about, as the title suggests, the context, dynamics, and possible forecast in the campaign to this point. Here's the basic outline. In fact, I won't get to all of this. Time won't permit. We have to say something about the Electoral College, however, because that's in fact who chooses the president. I will dwell on the campaign because that is the driving force of the result. We hope, at least it is. I'll focus on the presidential campaign. I'll just bracket that actually the campaigns for Congress are important as well. The Senate obviously is important, but the House actually is important as well. Even though the Democrats are almost certain to win it, it would help a lot at the margin if they win it by more than they did in 2018. I'll say some things about polarization because that's an important backdrop to a lot of the rest of what will be said, and it also helps us interpret what's going on in the campaign. The business about casting and counting the vote, I'm not going to use the slides about that. I think Robert will take us in, and Bruce will take us into that conversation. So I'll end with the polarization stuff. But first of all, the foundational rules of the game. Why am I not getting a... Okay, here we go. The Electoral College. You could say a lot about it, but there are two essential things. One is that the president is chosen by electors who are allocated across states in a certain way, but in all but 2 states, the electoral votes for the state are cast as a unit. All votes go to whichever candidate gets the plurality in the state, a larger share than any other candidate, with the exception of Maine, which actually uses a majority formula and an instant runoff kind of ballot. So the unit rule, okay? The Constitution actually says nothing about how a state's electoral vote is allocated to candidates. It just simply states that there shall be a body of electors and sets out a formula for assigning the number of electors to states. So it was left to states. And fairly quickly, as the country moved towards a kind of mass politics, people started to figure out that the logic of faction was in play here. And this is a notion that you may recognize anytime you've been to a committee meeting that you realize was wired in advance, possibly a department meeting. In any case, the notion is that if a small number of people can coordinate amongst themselves and everybody else is uncoordinated, that small number can exert a disproportionate influence on the outcome. From the state's point of view, that creates an incentive to unify the vote for the state, to have a unit rule. People quickly figure this out. Other states copy it, and relatively quickly, after the onset of mass participation in presidential elections, the unit rule became essentially universal. The only two states that don't abide by this are Maine and Nebraska, which allocate a portion of their delegation according to the results in individual congressional districts. But the unit rule is the essential rule. The allocation of electors across states embodies what was called the Connecticut Compromise at the Constitutional Convention. Regardless of size, the state gets 2 senators, but then House seats are allocated by representation by population. The combination of the two then determines how many electors a state has. There are 100 senators, there are 435 representatives, plus 3 electors were allocated to the District of Columbia. So the Electoral College comprises 538 electors. 270 is the margin to decide. So you'll hear references to 270, that's what it's about. There's a slight overrepresentation of small states, mostly as a result of the fact that there are 2 senators per state regardless of size. But even in the House of Representatives, a state like Wyoming still has a smaller population than any of the electoral districts in California, for example. So there is an overrepresentation of small states. But the more important fact is that because of the unit rule, it is competitive states that are important. If you think of a campaign as an investment of resources in a competitive state is going to have more of an effect at the margin than the same investment would have in an uncompetitive state, even a state where you happen to be in the lead. And this is especially true if it's a large state like Pennsylvania. But the states that are competitive are thought of as the battleground. Here's a way of representing it. You can think about the battleground in 2 ways. One is, what are the most competitive states? That's one way to think about it. The other is, what states are most likely to be the so-called tipping point, the states that put a candidate's electoral total over 270. In 2000, 2004, 2012, and 2016, these logics led to the same basic focus because these were incredibly closely contested elections. As things stand at the moment, this election is not shaping up to be as closely contested as most of those. This is actually looking rather more like 2008, at least it does so far. And so the tipping point state, the one that I've put in bold, is Pennsylvania. If you sort of organize the states from the most Democratic to the most Republican, Pennsylvania is the state that sits right at the boundary around 270 electoral college votes. But if you look further down the list from Pennsylvania, you notice that there's a bunch of positive numbers. That is, Biden has a lead in places where he did not have leads, where Democrats didn't have leads for a long time. So Florida is very much in play. It's always been an important battleground state, but also Arizona, which has been tightening up progressively over the last several years. North Carolina, which has taken us by surprise in recent years, but is also now in play. But it sort of defies belief that Georgia is now amongst these. It's not projected to go for Biden, but it is a competitive state by all appearances. It's actually more competitive, it would appear, than Iowa, which the Democrats actually won quite often in this century, and Ohio, which they've won occasionally at least. And then there's Texas down at the bottom there, creeping into contention. Probably not this time around, but in the future. So the record on the battleground suggests that Joe Biden ought to win numerically a fairly comfortable electoral college victory. People nonetheless are worried that it won't hold, that this is a febrile thing, and that it might go away. So what I want to do is sort of draw your attention to kind of countrywide dynamics. Here I've just basically created some plots that take into account national polls. Now, national polls don't decide the result. Remember, it is the Electoral College. So in some sense, national polls, or even the national popular vote, are of historic interest. They carry no special value. I hate to say it, but that's the truth. So one question is, Biden is ahead, but is the race tightening? Are the trends in an adverse direction for him? And the answer seems to be no. The race did tighten modestly in kind of the late summer, early fall, largely reflecting the sequence of nominating conventions. But the race has, if anything, widened in the last few weeks. If you want to just summarize it this way, so this is just simply Biden minus Trump, Trump being the incumbent. So I've set it up in negative numbers, partly to do some comparisons. You know, so in the two-party division of the vote, so put aside all the rest of it, the lead for Biden has fluctuated mildly. Trump pulled within maybe 9 percentage points, but the margin is now roughly where it was at the beginning of the convention season. So the horizontal axis here is days to election. 120 takes you back to early July. So I wanted to capture the convention season. We could talk about longer stretches if you want, but the lead does not seem to be narrowing. Some might still ask, how is it that a philanderer, a thief, a tyrant, whatever, could even be plausible? How is it that we're even talking about this? Well, the answer mostly is the polarization of the party system. It has become an intensely polarized political landscape. If you go back to 1980, this is the election that brought Ronald Reagan to power, and just look at a couple of things. As you scan your way from 1980 to the present, first thing you notice is a lot more dynamics within campaigns in the earlier years. And as you go towards the present, campaigns become much more static than they were before. The other thing you'll notice is that if you just look at the end dates for each of these things, from 1980 to 1996, it moves around quite a bit, right? A competitive result, a one-sided Republican result, a not quite so one-sided Republican result, fairly strong Democratic result, stronger Democratic result, and then you hit 2000. And with the exception of 2008, the results all now cluster around quite a tight band, right around 50%. So from that perspective, actually, given the polarized nature of the system, the 10 or so percentage points that Biden is leading by is actually a pretty big number. So polarization, I'll just the basics here is that Congress is polarized. We're seeing this in the events of the moment. The confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett is the current example. The impeachment business and all the rest of it. That it was the case 50 years ago that there were some Republicans who were more liberal than some Democrats. Now there's no Republican who is more liberal than any Democrat. That's just simply ended. Some of that has to do with the transformation of the South, but it's actually a trend within most of the various regions as well. This expresses itself in the minds of ordinary Americans, partisan minds. Democrats and Republicans have gotten sorted so that just as Congress representatives and senators are polarized, Democrats are now much more consistently liberal and are so across a broad range of questions than Republicans are. Democrats do not trust Republicans in office, and Republicans do not trust Democrats in office. There's always been partisan bias in trust, but it's reached extreme levels. partisan hearts. Affective polarization is the concept du jour in electoral studies right now, and the basic stuff of this is that Democrats and Republicans don't like each other. The percentage of Democrats and Republicans who would consider or receive with equanimity the prospect that one of their children would marry someone from the other party, it's gone out the window. It's like 10% would be approving in this respect. And the proportion of the population who are prepared to accept that violence is a legitimate part of the political order if the other side threatens to win has gone up strikingly. And finally, this polarization extends to institutions that we think of or used to think of as non-political. So the police, the military, churches, these did not divide the parties much 50 years ago. Now these are Republican non-political institutions. At the other end, science, universities, by which people mainly mean universities on the coasts, are democratic institutions where they did not used to be. So the polarization runs through US society, and as parts increasingly fixes the candidates in place. And so this, I think, is the last one I will use. And this is just, if you're particularly paranoid and are worrying that Joe Biden is just poised to plummet the way Hillary Clinton did, well, he may be, but here is a focused 2020 versus 2016 comparison where I've looked at the Democratic lead. And first thing that hits you is that there's more flux in 2016 than there is this year. Clinton's lead was occasionally as wide as Biden's has been, but most of the time it was not. The bounce of the early stages of 2016 is the succession of Republican and then Democratic conventions, but her lead over Trump actually was only about 4 points in September. It expands in the aftermath of the Access Hollywood controversy, but then the impact of the Comey revelations, if that's the word, was already being registered by this point in the last campaign. So from that point of view, at least, Biden looks like he should win. He should win by a comfortable electoral college margin, but there's all this cabinet of horrors waiting for us in terms of casting the vote, counting the vote, and even translating the vote into the electoral college, and whether or not indeed the vote will be accepted. So with that, I will stand down if I can get out of here. Now I can't seem to escape. Can you?
There you go. You've done it.
Somebody just stop my share and, okay, there we go.
Thank you very much, Dick. That was great. So next we have Bruce Baum, who's going to talk for a few minutes.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for everybody for inviting me. Hopefully I have something useful to say to you all. A couple of first thoughts. First, I haven't seen anything like this in my lifetime. And my mom, who's now 89, has said she hasn't seen anything quite like this in her lifetime. And this isn't just because of the pandemic, but perhaps I'm signaling all these worrisome factors that Dick was alluding to so well. Second, I'm kind of set up here as the person who's going to speak about kind of racial and gender divisions of this election season. So I want to say something about my own position here as a white guy speaking to all this, which I am, and that certainly limits some aspects of how I can understand all this and how it impacts me. But I'm also a white scholar who's been long concerned about issues of racial and gender justice. And in terms of my own work and my way of thinking about this, I'm somebody who at least consciously has certainly not been invested in protecting white privilege, although there might be unconscious aspects of that. I'm also cognizant of the way that BIPOC folks have so often been leaned on to deal with these issues, so I'm going to do the best I can. It's also the case that I'm a US citizen, so I have particular investments that I've already sent in my vote to the state of Minnesota in the Midwest. I'm going to sort of focus my remarks on two topics that we've been kind of asked to speak about. So I'll just say some provisional things from the start. And I have fairly formal remarks, so I'm going to be looking down a little bit. But at first, I want to say a little bit, and this is going to be provisional and more a matter of just kind of laying out how I see things more than saying anything solid. I want to say something about the impact of racialized violence and in the US over the last, well, really the course of US history, but the way that's been heightened in terms of public consciousness after the killing of George Floyd in my former city of Minneapolis in the late springtime, and how that's might be affecting things. I'll say that the electoral effects of this are not completely clear to me, but so I'm just going to lay it out because I think there are countervailing forces going on. On one side, we have the mobilization of people from the movement for Black Lives and the ongoing resonance of that movement. And that movement has included not only many BIPOC people, but also many white folks, particularly younger white Americans. And it's been a quite impressive mobilization. It's likely that that's been an energizing thing to many probable Democratic voters. On the other hand, there's the question of how President Trump's efforts to spin this recent history of events into questions of violent protests and to matters of law and order and the need to maintain law and order has resonated. My guess is it's resonated some, but probably mostly with his base. And I don't know that how much more widely it's resonated than that, but I'm not entirely sure. The second thing, and then one other reason that I'm not so sure is I'm not so convinced that Joe Biden or even Kamala Harris are the most obvious tribunes of racial justice. So I'm not sure how effective they're going to be in really mobilizing people. So one of the things that was a problem for the Democrats when Hillary Rodham Clinton was running in 2016 was some drop off in voting from BIPOC people, particularly Black Americans. Now, obviously, there are good reasons for them to vote this time, but I'm not sure how effective the mobilizations are going to be. But I suspect they'll be pretty solid. But that leads to my second point. So we've been asked to consider a little bit the insidious design of disenfranchisement of voters of color, and I want to say a little bit about that. I'm not going to try to detail the broader terrain, but I'll try to say a little bit about this. We know that in the past decade or so, that Republicans in states where they've controlled state governments have generally made it harder for poor people to vote. And poor people in the United States are disproportionately people of color. They've tended to play kind of hardball politics, being, I think, more concerned about winning elections than small d democratic politics and empowering citizens to vote in an equal way. So I want to give you some bits of information that have just jumped out at me, but I'm going to go back a little bit to talk about the state of Georgia. So I'm going to use Georgia as an example. So consider that in 2018, and Dick has already referred to the competitiveness of Georgia, which is relatively a new thing over the last couple of decades, that Democrats are competitive statewide in Georgia and for the presidency. In the 2018 governor's race, we know that Stacey Abrams nearly, as the Democratic candidate, nearly pulled off what was considered a kind of an upset. She lost, though, by about 48.8% of the vote to the Republican current governor, with 50.2%, with, I think, independent candidates winning about 1% of the vote. But there are also reports that seem pretty reliable that Democratic votes were suppressed, and perhaps mostly in fairly subtle ways. So I want to highlight that. Now I'm going to get back to that, but I want to highlight a couple of other things that are jumping out in recent news reports from the New York Times. So first, polling data suggests that in the presidential race right now, Joe Biden and President Trump seem to be roughly tied at about 45% of likely voters. unchanged more or less in the last month. And the two Senate races seem to be relatively equal, or even, I should say, between the Democrats and the Republicans. Now, that said, I'm going to read a little bit from the New York Times. According to the Times, the president remains competitive, though, because he has overwhelming support among white Georgians without a college degree. They back Trump by, at least according to current polls, 76% to 18% for Biden, including an even wider margin of 83% to 13% among white voters without a college degree in non-metropolitan counties, say far from Atlanta and other bigger urban areas. Now, looming in the background, though, are also questions of possible voter suppression or simple or other more subtle forms of inequality in who's able to vote and get their votes counted. So the Times also reported on September 27th that it seemed in Georgia that Black and Latino Georgians might be on the precipice of exercising a significant political voice in turning over the Electoral College to the Democrats and winning the Senate seats. But the Times put in a caveat, if they get a chance to vote. And meanwhile, here's a story from the New York Times on October 13th. On Tuesday morning, some voters waited 3 hours at Houston County's early voting site in Perry, Georgia, though according to the assistant supervisor of elections, they said that by the afternoon, wait times had decreased to 20 or 30 minutes. But think about that, having to wait 3 hours potentially in line to vote. Also on Tuesday of the same week, the week of October 13th, Judge Michael Brown of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia turned away a lawsuit requesting that he order additional personnel, training, equipment, and emergency paper ballots at Georgia polling places to alleviate long lines. Documents filed in a lawsuit in August by the Democratic Party concluded that the polling lines were longer in Georgian neighborhoods with large numbers of Black voters. Meanwhile, here's another sort of news story based on polls. I've already kind of said part of this, but consider again that national polling has consistently showed that white college-educated voters are strongly supporting Biden. But in Georgia, even as major demographic and population shifts have pulled the state toward the Democrats, a majority of even college-educated white voters are still firmly in the Trump camp, and those who are not college-educated are even more strongly in the Trump camp. Now, here's my real concern, and I'm worried about how this might play out throughout the country. There seems to be a pretty good reasons to worry that these white voters are going to have a much easier time voting and getting their votes counted than those in Georgia neighborhoods with large numbers of Black voters. And this seems to be a danger in a number of different states. Also, there was another report in the New York Times in the last week or so that there already seems to be evidence that in the mail-in voting, which is one of the things that's kind of looming over this, how well are the mail-in votes going to count, that likely Democratic votes seem to be more likely thrown out by a small margin. Now, on the one hand, going to what Dick was saying, it seems like Biden's margins are strong enough that losing little bits of votes probably are not necessarily going to undermine him. But they might make a difference in some of these Senate campaigns. They might make a difference in some of these congressional campaigns. And if we're going to see major policy shifts in the United States, all of that matters. So I'm just throwing that out. But these are all the things that I see in play. So I'm going to leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Bruce. That was really helpful. So next, finally, we have Robert Russo from the School of Law. Oh, unmute.
Unmute. There you go. Thanks, Lisa, and thanks everyone for being here today. First, just a little bit about me. I've just got 2 slides for my intro, just to frame kind of the legal sort of like framework for the discussion. Don't worry about the small font here. Basically, I just have the slide up here just to illustrate how complex sort of like the legal framework is for US elections, because it's a national election in one way, but legally speaking, it's actually 50 plus 1 elections, District of Columbia, each with their own election codes, each with their own election processes. And although they're voting for a slate of electors, each state, legally speaking, at least treats those votes a little bit differently. Like, for example, you may have heard, the term faithless electors when voters are actually casting their vote. Let's say, for example, in Washington State, Hillary Clinton won Washington in 2016, 12 electoral votes. Well, actually, 4 of those electors decided to cast their electoral college vote for someone besides Hillary Clinton. Now, it turns out that that was a protest vote. But actually, there were some legal consequences, minor ones, that I think they were each fined $1,000 under the state election law in Washington. But it's just to illustrate that there's a different process in play here. And the complexity of it is we shouldn't be surprised that there are sometimes hiccups and problems in terms of US elections. I think what's different about this particular election, and Richard and Russo touched on it, is just how this legal framework is being used, I think, by one party in particular, probably the Republicans more so, but the Democrats are responding as well, too, in terms of what state legislatures have enacted in terms of laws to restrict voting and enact voting requirements that I'll touch on in a little bit. So if we could go to the next slide. This is the one actually that I think is important to look at, because I'm going to start with what I think, legally speaking, or at least in terms of litigation and law, is the most important thing, that we may not know the result on election night. And the reason for that is because of the unique circumstances of this election with COVID going on. There's been an unprecedented outpouring of mail-in voting. Mail-in and absentee voting has always been used in US elections. It's not uncommon. I'll touch on it more later, and we'll probably get some questions on it, but it's a particularly reliable form of voting. In this election, there have been, I think, over 43 million mail-in ballots or absentee ballots already returned. It's estimated that there's going to be millions more by the time Election Day arrives on November 3rd. There's also disparities on who is utilizing mail-in voting. Pretty much the evidence, the preponderance of the evidence shows, and repeatedly, the Democrats are using mail-in voting and absentee voting far more than those who support Republican candidates are using, who prefer to vote in person or expressed a preference to vote on November 3rd in person. What this is going to create is a scenario, it's kind of like the storm scenario, where on election night, you might have a result that that is shaping up because of the in-person voting and the way the mail-in votes are counted, that doesn't reflect what will actually be the accurate result of the election. So what I have on screen here is again, I apologize for the small font, but I was trying to get all the battleground states here, or the important states in. I missed Arizona, apologies. But I did include Colorado, which actually really isn't a battleground state. But I put Colorado up there because it's sort of the gold standard for mail-in voting counting. It starts 2 weeks before Election Day on November 3rd. None of them can release the results until 7 p.m. on Election Day, but it gives them 2 weeks to at least count those millions of votes and have them ready to release. So you'll know Colorado's electoral votes pretty quickly after the polls close on November 3rd. Same thing with Arizona. Florida, surprisingly, for those of you who remember 2000, it's unlikely Florida is actually going to be, unless the result is another 500 vote cliffhanger, it probably will know the result on Florida the night of November 3rd. It's because of the way mail-in ballots are counted 22 days before Election Day, and they'll be released hopefully soon after polls close. The problem here is you have other states, Georgia, Iowa, Michigan. Michigan actually is a real problem because it varies by jurisdiction. According to each jurisdiction's law, counting of mail-in votes can't begin before Election Day, before November 3rd. If you go down to Ohio, they can scan ballots, but they can't start counting them, or at least they can't disclose the count until the closing of polls on November 3rd. Pennsylvania is a big problem because on election day is when they can start counting in the votes. Same with Texas, same with Wisconsin. So this creates a scenario then where you have in-person voting is counted first, and then there's this sort of perfect storm scenario that's been written up where, because of the preference for Republican voters to vote in person, it may look like President Trump actually has a huge lead. He declares victory in certain states, and then as the mail-in vote is slowly counted in many of these battleground states, Biden may overtake him, and then it amplifies the call for fraud, and then you can just see the all caps tweets coming out from the presidential Twitter account. The other issue here too, working my way backwards, is the litigation that's ongoing now. So this is after all the votes have been counted. So this is just how law comes into play once the polls close on November 3rd and the counting begins. I think that's where the major problems may happen. But there's also issues now happening beforehand. There have been over 300 cases that have been launched in most of the states in the US. I think it's 45 states now in the District of Columbia, in terms of, most of them in terms of, from both parties, Democratic state organizations in terms of generally expanding access for voting, curbside voting, earlier mail-in voting, absentee voting, expansion of sending out mail-in ballots to voters. And then there have been mostly Republican state legislatures that have been trying to sort of limit that on the argument that they're trying to ensure the integrity of the election process, as they put it, and prevent voter fraud. Now, both sides have had victories. In Pennsylvania, the Democratic Party has had litigation go in their favor, surprisingly by the Supreme Court of the United States, 4-4 decision, where the Chief Justice, John Roberts, actually sided with 3 more liberal justices in upholding a Pennsylvania law that extended mail-in voting by 3 days for the receipt of absentee ballots beyond November 3rd. The 3-day deadline was actually a compromise between Democratic legislators who wanted a longer deadline for mail-in voters and the Democratic governor, Tom Wolf. Republicans opposed it, and they wanted the state law upheld as enforcing the deadline as election day. It was upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. So that is going ahead. So Pennsylvania is another one where votes will continue to come in after election day and be counted. Now imagine a scenario where there's a couple of thousand votes separating President Trump and Vice President Biden on election night, and one side declares victory, but you have these potentially huge number of votes that still haven't been counted coming in. So again, a very probable scenario that could happen. You've had other situations in Wisconsin where the legislature passed laws in terms of limiting in-person absentee balloting under Scott Walker, the former governor. There, what happened is Walker passed legislation limiting absentee balloting, and then the legislature moved to limit the incoming Democratic governor's powers so that that couldn't be altered after the fact, after he assumed office in 2019. And that was the subject of some litigation as well. A couple of the more famous cases have involved Texas, where Harris County in particular, Harris County is where Houston is located, millions of voters, huge county, I've been there, it's sprawling. What Harris County executives tried to do is set up drop-off mail balloting sites, about a dozen of them around Harris County. So those who have less access to transportation, perhaps the disabled, those who are working more and can't get around the county as often as others, can have more convenient sites to drop off their ballots. Republicans and the Republican governor opposed that, and that was upheld by the Texas Supreme Court, limiting Harris County to just one drop-off site. So again, that law creates just one drop-off site for a huge county, for the city of Houston and the encompassing areas of it, for millions and millions of residents. That will be difficult in terms of how they can perhaps exercise the right to vote. Republicans in Texas tried a last-minute challenge to limit drive-through voting in Harris County. Drive-through voting was an option, again, for those who were working perhaps and didn't have as much time or had childcare responsibilities. Republicans tried to limit it. That was actually shot down. Texas is an interesting one because the Republicans there have been very, very active. They've actually even opposed the governor in Texas, who's a Republican, Greg Abbott, and he's had some very modest using executive powers in Texas in terms of the coronavirus crisis to expand early voting by a couple of days or a week. And that was opposed actually by the Texas State Republican Party as well, and it was unsuccessful. Latest example was the Alabama curbside voting, which was actually shot down by the state courts in Alabama and upheld by a 5-3 ruling by the Supreme Court of the United States. This time, Justice Roberts sided with the conservative justices, and I just found this out today, that they had actually, and the decision was issued yesterday, they upheld a limit on curbside voting in Alabama and sided with the Republican lawmakers who launched that challenge. The other thing I should point out here before I just end is all of these arguments are premised on this conception or the argument of voter fraud. And I have to say that the empirical evidence overwhelmingly suggests this is not a widespread problem in the United States. And you can take it from institutions like the Brennan Center, which have conducted many, many studies in terms of analyzing instances or complaints of voter fraud. What they find in those studies by the Brennan Center and the Brookings Institution is that voter fraud does exist, but first off, there's no differentiation between voting by mail and voting in person. So voting by mail is not inherently a more susceptible to legal crime of voter fraud. The second thing is that voter fraud itself is not really a widespread problem, at least by most definitions of it. And you don't have to just take liberal, like think tanks or democratic, legal institutions. You can look at small, capital D democratic. You can look at conservative institutions like the Heritage Foundation. Heritage Foundation has a database actually of the rates of what they call, voter fraud by states. And if you look at their own tables, they show states like Colorado, 14 cases of voter fraud in the heritage sample. States like Hawaii, 2 cases from 1982 to 2016. Oregon, 15 cases of voter fraud. Utah, 1 case. Washington, 12 cases from 2004 to 2010. So the point here is that, and this is in millions and millions of ballots that were cast during that time period. So I guess just to conclude, I wanted to frame that, that kind of like start here to say, there is an effort here to influence the election. And I think if you're looking at it from the law standpoint and the litigation that's been launched, my own fear is that this result has sort of been predetermined now in advance, like with the millions of votes cast and with the attempts to limit voting and suppress voting, particularly targeted upon certain areas. If those efforts are successful, they could have altered the election even before November 3rd arrives or had a determinative impact on that. So I think I'll just stop there, and then I'm sure we'll have some time to discuss some related questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I would love to get my hands on those slides later. So hopefully we'll be able to provide that with the recording for people to follow as the process goes through. Maybe I'll start in my questions, actually with just a follow-up to you, Robert, on, I perhaps missed something you were saying, but I didn't get much in that picture you were painting about the deadlines for ballots to arrive, which was the issue of substance in the Supreme Court case on Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah.
Can you give a picture of what kinds of scenarios we're looking at with how long it takes how long ballots are allowed to arrive on or after Election Day?
Yeah, so Pennsylvania is an interesting one because state law stipulates that ballots have to be postmarked, I believe, by the close of polls by 8 p.m. on November 3rd, and in any event on Election Day. So what the proposal was, because of the coronavirus situation and because of the heavy demands on the U.S. Postal Service, and I'm sure a lot of you remember the whole discussion and the argument about, and President Trump was tweeting a lot about this, about the Postal Service and about some money actually being withheld from the Postal Service. So the idea was to extend the deadline for ballots to be counted by being postmarked. I think the original proposal was up to a week, up to November 11th, and that they would still be valid and counted towards the election results. They reached a compromise between those legislatures and the governor, Tom Wolf, to make it 3 days after the election. I think it was by the end of business day, 5 p.m. on November 6th, I believe. That was challenged by GOP legislators who argued that the technical argument was that state law couldn't be changed by this proclamation, and it worked its way up to the Supreme Court. And essentially, Justice Roberts sided, the court deadlocked on it. The Supreme Court of the U.S. deadlocked on it 4-4. and sided with the liberal justices. There wasn't a lot of reasons given. There were some brief reasons given by, I think, Scalia gave some reasons, and one of the justices voting to uphold the Pennsylvania law gave reasons. But the basic premise of it was that it was an allowable expansion or extension given the extenuating circumstances existing at the time. And the three-day extension was a result of a compromise. Now, the obvious problem here is it ties into the Supreme Court, and we can talk about that too, in terms of what if Amy Coney Barrett had been on the court at the time, and how would the court have ruled? And some have speculated the court would have actually ruled the other way, 5-4, and probably shooting down the law, in which case then those late ballots wouldn't have been counted. The reason that's important, though, too, again, it goes back to who's going to be voting by mail. And who, and study after study has shown Democrats are going to be voting by mail, particularly in Pennsylvania, far more than Republicans. And those economic and demographic groups that are disadvantaged, that are vulnerable, that are part of the, people who hold 2 or 3 jobs, people who have childcare responsibilities, people who may not be able to vote on time for various reasons, might mail in their ballots late. And because the Postal Service has such a huge demand on it this year, there was that need to extend the deadline to allow those votes to at least be counted.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. I think I'll turn now to the question of polls, which, Dick, you were focusing on a fair amount and really providing the valuable reminder to all of us that national polls don't really matter. It matters how the vote is distributed state by state. But still, even as you showed what the picture looks like state by state, it looks like Biden is well ahead. So why is the Biden campaign then so cautious, aside from just fearing the 2016 scenario happening again? Is there kind of a realistic possibility that there's the shy Trump voter that we talked about in 2016 who prefers not to answer polls or not answer or misrepresent themselves in polls? What are some other reasons why the polls might not be accurately reflecting what the result will be?
There's no evidence for shy Trump voters or shy Tory voters or all the rest of it. I mean, there are celebrated instances along the way in which the polls miscalled the result. But in general, there doesn't seem to be any bias in terms of polling misses one way or the other. In 2012, for example, the polls suggested that the election was actually rather closer than it proved to be. Barack Obama won by about 1.5 percentage points more than forecast. I think the issue is, first of all, translation from national polls to state polls. There's a lot more investment in state level polls this time than last time. That was kind of the lesson of 2016. Although a not so well understood lesson of 2016 is that the state polls in 2016 actually didn't do as good a job as the national polls of nailing the result. And so forecasting models that built state polls into them, which most of them do, actually made their predictions worse, not better. But if you look at 2016 in terms of the national popular vote, it pretty much nailed it. That Hillary Clinton won, if my arithmetic memory is correct, she actually won the national popular vote by a wider margin than Barack Obama did in 2012. So it really is the translation of votes or vote intentions as expressed by polls into actual votes. And some of that, I think, gets us into the stuff that Robert is talking about, that people can have an intention to vote, but whether their ballots are counted is an issue, whether the, quite apart from the administrative machinery, whether the party's campaign operatives actually deliver people to the polls. So here's a striking fact about this year as opposed to previous years. The Trump campaign has many more county level offices than the Biden campaign has. In previous years, that was more the other way around. I mean, Trump didn't even have an apparatus really in 2016. But if you look at 2008 or 2012, the Obama organization had an incredible ground game. And this time, Trump seems to have invested in that ground game where Biden doesn't have as much of an investment, at least at least not as expressed by formal offices. And Trump has been campaigning. He has been going to the various states. Biden basically has not. So if there is any kind of enthusiasm effect from that, that's going to distort the predictive power of the polls. Although in general, when you look at indicators of enthusiasm, it is the Democrats who are charged up more than the Republicans.
Thanks very much. Bruce, you talked quite a bit about suppression of votes by racialized minorities. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about your sense of where support for either side is among different BIPOC, Black and Indigenous people of color groups. If you want to talk about groups of women as well, and maybe how gender and race are intersecting in different groups, that I would love to have your take on that. I mean, I read a story from the New York Times that was talking about the tremendous gender gap in the Latino vote, where there's possibly more support or less support for Biden than there was for Clinton among Latino men, and by a long range, like over 30% women are more in favor of Biden than Latino men, for example, just as an example. But can you talk about maybe how that plays out and maybe what the reasons would be for these differences across minority groups?
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at that. I mean, first of all, the biggest division that way has been for a while now, at least for a few election cycles, non-white, white. So there is that. But then there is the gender gap is differentiates that. So among white folks, maybe women this time are going to be voting for Biden, where I believe white women actually voted for Trump, surprisingly, by a somewhat small margin, where white men voted for Trump by a pretty substantial margin in 2016. But whites taken as a whole have been voting for Republicans for quite a while now in presidential elections. Then, yeah, certainly with Latinx people. So again, the white, non-white, there's a question, it seems to me, of turnout. And the question, I think you're right, that it's not clear that Latinx people are going to vote as strongly for Biden as they did for Clinton. And that may also be the case among Black voters. The one thing that has struck me about Black voters is the difference in the enthusiasm gap probably between older Black voters and younger Black voters. For a lot of us, and I think a lot of Black voters and a lot of others concerned about racial justice, Joe Biden is not obviously a great candidate when one tracks his history, where to some extent he was a little bit of a representative of white resentment at times in the 1970s, and at least white hesitancy to support a racial justice agenda. And then he also has his own role in ratcheting up criminal justice and incarceration that disproportionately affects Black and other BIPOC people in the United States, but particularly Black Americans. So I think older Black Americans have been on board and helped him win the nomination, but I think younger Black Americans, including a lot of people in the movement for Black Lives, it seems like their motivations to vote have more to do with the dangers and of Donald Trump more than what Biden has to offer. Now, that said, one could look at one could look at Biden and Harris from that perspective and say, okay, their hearts may be in the right place and there's some movement. It seems to me that Biden has moved more, and he's not necessarily the Joe Biden of the 1970s. I think that's true, but I think there is probably an enthusiasm gap there. I think you're also getting at something in terms of the way this is playing out in terms of the gender dynamics. It seems from what I've gathered, that that's probably going to be an issue in the Latinx community as much as elsewhere, and then probably in the white community. And I don't know exactly how that's going to play out. Dick might have a better sense of details of the polling. Those seem to be definitely things to look out for. One other thing that I'm just going to say, picking up on something that Robert said about Florida, I was wondering about Florida, and I was wondering about the counting of votes, because my mom and her companion these days are among the people who are older Floridians who mailed in their voting. And I was kind of wondering, and I'm actually glad to hear that, because many of us, I remember looking at the 2016 election and thinking if Florida and North Carolina went for Clinton, it was going to be election over. And of course, they didn't go for Clinton. I'm thinking now that if Florida goes for Biden, it's probably going to be pretty much election over, because I can't see how Trump wins without Florida. And it also seems like if Florida doesn't go for Biden, that doesn't mean election over in any sense, that there's other paths for Biden to win. So that should be noted. But it does seem like if we find out a Biden win in Florida, many of us who are hoping for a Biden win could probably rest a little bit easier. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Dick, I'm wondering if you want to comment on any of that. First, if you have any thoughts about the polling, but also I want to throw in there the question of youth and what we seem to know about youth enthusiasm for turning up to vote this time around. I can't help but notice that my own teenage son even was enthralled by the fact that AOC was playing on Twitch yesterday with 400,000 plus people following along. Do you have any sense of that at all?
I don't, and there are these contradictory indications. So Bruce emphasized generational differences within racialized communities. It seems that they're real, right? Then again, it's a generational difference in motives more than necessarily in behavior. And it may be more important post-election for how the Democratic coalition evolves and what people in Congress do when the agenda starts to get enacted, if it does. I'm generally suspicious of claims about dynamics that are sort of specific to groups within groups. To talk about Hispanic women. Well, 2016 we talked a lot about white women, who it turned out gave a narrow majority to Trump, and that somehow we were supposed to concoct an explanation about this. Well, it wasn't about there being white women; it's that they were white. That the gap, the gender gaps, were generally about the same in these various groups, and so mostly we're talking about a kind of additive phenomenon. But age is particularly interesting because, whenever you pick up an age difference, you have generational differences, but there's also life course differences. And it'll be really interesting to see whether the enthusiasm, for example, Lisa, that you're picking up translates into actually going to the polls. Because what we know is that there are abiding differences by virtue of age that are life cycle differences in the general willingness to go to the polls, the general mobilizability of young people. And from that point of view, COVID may actually be good news for the Democrats. Actually, it is good news for the Democrats generally, but in this particular, because if it were not for COVID, millions of those kids would be out of the home. And from the point of view of electoral turnout, the shift from a 21-year-old to an 18-year-old franchise was actually kind of a disaster, because the ages 18 to 22 in some ways are the worst possible years to initiate people into a life course of participation. We'd be better off having a 16-year-old threshold rather than 18, as a matter of fact, because 16-year-olds what are they doing? They're taking social studies. They're at home. But this year, uniquely, well, we hope it's uniquely, because of the coronavirus, they're all at home.
So by that, presumably, you mean there are conversations going on at home that are influencing them towards
that, but also they're at a residence which is the family residence, right? So
they're reachable.
Part of the story of voter mobilization is the accessibility of the individual to the mobilization efforts of people who want to turn them out to vote. Now, what those mobilization efforts are this time, thanks to the virus, is a whole other story. But to the extent that there is some machinery of mobilization, you know where those kids are, right? They're at the parental address for the most part.
Yeah, great. I understand Bruce wants to jump in here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about youth and some of the, well, maybe one of the particular issues, say the environment and climate change issues. So it appears that we're going to hear something about this in the debate tonight. Insofar as it's a debate, that's another whole issue. But to go back to perhaps your son and others, there seems to be a generational gap a little bit in terms of attentiveness to and concern with climate change. And that would favor Biden and the Democrats substantially for anybody who's paying attention. I think that's pretty clear. But I'm just raising the question here that this goes back to Dick's point about how much this is going to translate into actual voting. Historically, people in the 18 to 27 age bracket have been a little bit less inclined than older people to go out to vote. So I wonder if that's going to be a little bit different, even small margins, given that's a big age group in terms of number of people. You know, a few more percentages of people going out to vote could make a significant difference. I don't know, and I haven't really followed the polling data that closely on that, but that's one of the things that I'm looking out for, and I'm curious to see how much young people are going to vote. Also, things like the movement for Black Lives has certainly inspired younger people, and I'm not sure how much that's going to carry. That'll in particular will carry over, but that's another issue there. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, if you look at the picture Dick was painting in the beginning, it does seem it's going to all be around the margins about who can get the most people around the edges additionally voting. Robert, maybe I'll turn to you now to ask about, can you give us a little bit of a sense of what will happen? you kind of talked about there's going to be this delay in the counting. What can the country kind of stand this turmoil of challenges that are going to happen and are apparently all prepped up and ready to go for after Election Day? What kinds of dangers do you see? Oh, unmute yourself again.
Sorry about that. No, the dangers I see are, well, twofold. One are interference in terms of foreign interference in the election. There's already been reports of emails being sent to Democratic voters in Florida and some other battleground states from apparently from Iran, from Russia, that are sort of in threatening, intimidating emails or some misinformation, you know, state-sponsored, I think, meddling. I'm not so much worried about interference directly in altering vote counts, but just efforts to depress votes worries me. The effect that could have on how the election is perceived to be legitimate by the losing side in particular. And then I'm worried about, and this kind of dovetails into try to get a little bit more positive outlook in sense of violence. And when there's if the election is close, if the election is close and the result remains in doubt, and you have a president who is not interested in tamping down emotions, but in ramping them up, then I'm really worried about what's going to happen in terms of the days afterward. I think litigation, especially litigation before the election, isn't all bad because both sides engage in it to try to secure, their own interests and own rights. And I'd rather have people going into the courtroom to do that than other ways of trying to settle their differences. What I'm worried about, though, is just the erosion of just the erosion of democracy, because I think voting is such an important right, and people have lost sight of that in the U.S. In particular, and a little bit in Canada too, I guess. But I mean, and to the extent you have actors like Russia, actors like Iran interfering in it, and you have the U.S. government too, or the head of the U.S. government at least, not being interested in sort of portraying it as a legitimate process. That's what worries me. In a way, I think I'm kind of optimistic this may not happen. I actually think, and I might be in line here with Bruce and Richard, I'm not sure. I think it'll be a close election, but I don't think it'll be that close. I think we'll know who wins one way or another on the night of November 3rd, because I think looking at it that we'll be able to tell who won Florida, who won Arizona, who won a few other states that are important, and get a sense. I don't expect that if the president were to lose that he would admit that, but I think if it was clear that he would lose, that even the Republican Party would start to abandon him at that point, because it's their own self-interest, I think, to do that. So I'm a little bit optimistic, let's say that way. What I'm worried about, though, is again a really, really even closer election than 2016, something similar to 2000. Where you have litigation after the election, and 2000 actually was, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, but it was actually before the electors were chosen. There's some, really bad scenarios where litigation continues after the electors are chosen. There's litigation over competing slates of electors and all sorts of things. So, and you could see maybe both Biden and Trump saying that they were elected legitimately at that point. That's what really concerns me.
Thank you very much. That is scary, hopeful hint that Trump will in fact take signals from the party in the end when the rats all jump off the ship. I'm not intending that in a pejorative sense at all. It's just a saying. And I'll just ask maybe first Dick and then Bruce, do you have anything to add to what is worrying you right now about Election Day?
Well, I worry about how the events of the day are interpreted by the media. It is broadly true that the decision desks don't rely much on exit polls anymore, and that would be crazy in this election, because who's exiting the polls after all? That they're really attentive to how the sequence of the voting takes place within a state. Rural places will report more quickly than urban places, for example. Rural places are less likely to use mail-in ballots than urban places, that sort of thing. So it'll be very important to be interpreting numbers from particular locales relative to 2016 rather than in some absolute sense. And really, you shouldn't really be calling it unless it's dead clear. So we'll see whether the media resist that impulse. But my worry is that they will play into the Trump narrative that Robert talked about they will inadvertently legitimate the peculiar vote of Election Day relative to the mail-in ballot. So that's a real worry. I think maybe I'll just leave it at that and let Bruce come in.
Thank you. Bruce, last word to you before we turn to questions from the audience.
Yeah, first I'll just echo what Dick said. Those things concern me, the same things. The other thing I am concerned about is possibilities of voter suppression and possibly even more subtle ways that I was talking about, like in places in Georgia where if there's a significant turnout on Election Day, particularly in poor and Black communities in particular, there's not going to be enough voting equipment, and it's the ease of voting is going to be difficult, and not everybody is going to be able to get to vote, and not everybody's going to be able to get their vote counted. It seems clear to me I feel fairly optimistic that if all the votes are counted and everybody who really is intending to vote votes, that this may not be a particularly close election. At least we have some reason to think that there would be a fairly substantial margin. But I'm not so sure that things are going to play out that way. And then if things don't play out that way, I do think there are possibilities for, say, Trump to play it, to spin it in certain ways that are worrisome, and for the media to not be careful enough, particularly perhaps in terms of, I gather that this is pretty unprecedented, balancing those who are voting that day and the indications of that vote versus the mail-in votes, in particularly places they come in later. I think it seems to me, in my recollection, unprecedented to have the likelihood of so many mail-in votes, and in many cases they're going to be counted not right on the day. And the fact that, as Robert was saying, they're more likely to be Democratic votes, and then that can just be spun. And so that's Dick also has already said that, but those are my real worries.
Yeah, thank you. We'll see. Becca, do you have questions from the audience that you want to throw out?
I have so many questions.
Okay, we better leave time.
And a lot of similar worries coming from our audience. So I've tried to group some of these together. But maybe the first follow-up question here is maybe for Robert, if we could dig into this a little bit. If Biden is declared the winner, could there be a legal challenge from Trump that could hold up the inauguration? And follow up to that, which is similar, can we forecast citizens' reaction regardless of who wins?
Robert, you're muted again. You're muted again.
I keep forgetting to do that. I'm using my iPad Pro today, so different system. No, in terms of an official winner, that's not decided until a couple of weeks after after voting day, when the electors meet and actually, the results are certified and the ballots counted. So the danger zone really is that period, and Richard was alluding to this, where, on election night, and during that period in November and early December, where there is no official winner, and then the results are, again, changed because of the mail-in counting days afterwards. So what looks like maybe a decisive Trump victory becomes a pretty clear Biden victory in the days afterwards. And because of the way President has, signaled that he's not really going, that already, said that there's, the voting process is rigged, as he's put it, and, the fraudulent voting. That time period is used to launch litigation in terms of disputing the selection of electors in certain states. There's, in terms of litigation of counting certain ballots that shouldn't have been counted, basically trying to tie up the process. Now, it would play out, though, relatively, I have confidence actually in the US legal system that I think it could handle it, and it would play out in a way that by mid-December you would have it resolved, like in Bush versus Gore. The problem, though, is now, especially after Bush v. Gore, if a case were to somehow work its way up to the Supreme Court and the court were to rule on this, and Barrett is sitting on the court, and then it rules, let's say, and let's say it's a disputed election similar to 2000, and rules in Trump's favor, I don't think you would, I'm not so sure that the American system will be able to take it in the same way that they took it in 2000, because you saw, from everything I've saw, that Bush v. Gore eroded trust in the judiciary to the point, significantly. And I think it contributed to the growing polarization of the courts, and politics in general. And so that is the, and that whole, blends into that whole scenario then that you could have a president who's inaugurated then who's considered illegitimate, officially illegitimate by large sections of the country. And so that is what worries me. I'm hoping that, though, that the situation will be settled or play out relatively shortly. And again, if the result, 2000 was such a strange scenario where you had such a close result in one decisive state, that the probability of that happening again, hopefully, I don't think is very large, and hopefully it won't happen this time.
That's encouraging. I hadn't thought about it that way. I was imagining a replay of Bush v. Gore and it being even more contentious, but that's a good point.
Related question. How can voter suppression be minimized? Not necessarily referring to mail-in ballots, but just in general, even from external actors. And as Richard Price just noted in the chat here, are there not laws in some states, at least, that if people are in line at the polls before closing time, the poll must remain open until they vote?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, there are. And that has been some of the efforts to challenge some of those laws. In terms of restricting voting times and keeping certain voting locations open past their official closing times. Most of the initiatives to keep them open, so people standing in line, for example, to vote, have been upheld. What you have, though, is you have to. This is an area where, and maybe Richard and Bruce could speak to this too, but you have to have observers on the ground during election day. And not only just to ensure people can vote, like there's cases of people from the 2004 election, for example, Kerry versus Kerry Bush. I don't know if some remember, Ohio was a pretty close state then, but they had irregularities where people in line were basically subject to a little bit of intimidation, where you had college campuses where, because of breakdowns in voting machines in Ohio in 2004, where they were told, well, you can't legally vote anymore because the polls are closed. And then they were told, no, you can vote. So some students left the lineup, some returned later, but basically votes weren't counted. So from that experience, you have these observers. Sometimes they're lawyers who are there. Sometimes unions will hire, for Democrats, generally labor unions will hire observers to make sure that people who are in line can vote. Because what happens is you have some groups sometimes who go there and will say, well, we're polling officials and you're not able to vote, go home, and people at the back of a lineup might just leave, at that point. And so those kinds of things, chicanery, that's illegal. But but you have to have people in line there who know the law, who can kind of tell you, no, this is your right, stay in line and vote, and don't leave, because then you're going to lose the right to vote.
Sorry, go on, Lisa.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure if Dick or Bruce wants to jump in on any of that at all.
Yeah.
I'll just give you a footnote. If Al Gore had won New Hampshire in 2000, the course of human history would be completely different. New Hampshire had 4 electoral votes. Al Gore was basically 2 votes short. Just an observation.
Can I chime in here for a second for New Hampshire? New Hampshire is actually one of the nightmare scenarios that's actually a little bit more likely to happen, because given the small population, given how close it was in 2016, although the polls showed a bit different this time. But if it were to be close, and if it were a couple hundred votes, New Hampshire doesn't actually start counting its mail-in votes until election day. So they would be one of the ones where it could change afterwards, and there could be a small margin. So if New Hampshire is pretty small, so if the election was that close, that's one thing to watch out for. So watch who wins New Hampshire.
What's next?
So on the issue of overseeing elections, there's a question here in the chat from Amit. Why is there no neutral elections body akin to Elections Canada in the US? It's quick. Dick, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'll take it. With Robert probably should come in as well. I mean, the most basic backdrop to all of this is that it's not just the presidential election. It is choices being made all the way down to county and municipal levels, as well as various statewide plebiscites. And so, in a sense, the unit that makes sense to devolve the responsibility to basically is the county or its municipal equivalent or its parish, or depending on the state. The unit at which the ballot is effectively common for everybody voting on a given day. So that would be the starting point. Congress could, as I understand it, they could establish a national electoral machinery, and of course there are court decisions that have bearing on all of this. Much of what Robert's talking about is the Constitution as interpreted by the court or certain federal statutes, but it's pretty hard to imagine a detailed level of oversight for the entirety of the system. I mean, the federal government would essentially have to detach its own elections from everything else, and that just seems quite unlikely. You could still then ask, why aren't there nonpartisan electoral machinery in state by state? And there's sort of somewhat nonpartisan machinery in some states. If a state is divided politically enough that either the two houses of the state legislature are at odds with each other, or the governor is at odds with the legislature, that's often where you get a saw-off, as in Iowa. But in general, where one party sees it has the ability to control the apparatus, it goes for it. That's sort of the governing rule. And then finally, there is the Federal Election Commission. Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, but have the Republicans finally decided to give it a quorum by appointing Republicans to it? Because the last time I remember talking about this, it could never meet because the Republicans just said, oh, the hell with it. They just didn't nominate people, and so there was no quorum.
I don't think they actually have nominated yet. There hasn't been a quorum to it. No, not for quite a period, actually.
So I'm cognizant of the time we have left. There is a question from Isabel. We haven't really dug into this just yet, but she says, I was wondering what both parties are planning on doing with the Affordable Health Care Act, as well as I'm curious about Amy Coney Barrett and the implications of her getting into the Supreme Court.
Sounds like a Robert question again, at least with the Supreme Court.
Sure. Well, I'll let Bruce or Richard talk about the ACA a bit. But I mean, Amy Coney Barrett. No, I mean, it's interesting. I've looked at her. She has a very limited record in terms of as a judge. She hasn't been on Court of Appeals for that long. She has a lot of writings as a professor at Notre Dame. It's fair to expect her to be, what is expected of her nomination in terms of social issues, in terms of, Roe versus Wade. One of the things you can tell from her testimony was she, although it wasn't very revealing because she didn't really clearly answer many questions, she did comment that she didn't think Roe versus Wade was super precedent, which is interesting. So it at least signals an openness to looking at it again in a way that Marbury versus Madison or Brown versus Board of Education are different. In terms of the ACA, there's no reason to expect her to be, I think, friendly to it. And I think now that she would be the sixth conservative justice on the court, even if you had Roberts move towards the middle ground or the liberal ground, I don't see necessarily a favorable outcome to it. But I'll let Richard or Bruce comment a little bit more on that.
Well, I'll say.
I mean, I just agree. I mean, I think that the good news is the Democrats will have a less difficult coalitional task in the next Congress, probably. But the question of whether all these kinds of regulations that are in effect the use of the commerce power to regulate what are state level mechanisms, exchanges, for example. I mean, I would think that Barrett is just going to continue the trend of the court towards these kind of new federalist decisions that basically cut the federal government out.
Bruce, do you want to say?
I guess the only thing I'll add is obviously there's some discussion among Democrats about expanding the number of people in the court. That seems like a tricky way to go because it's been done before, so it's not unprecedented. But we can imagine then Republicans do it when they're in power. But it is interesting that it does seem to me that the Democrats have a case for doing that, given that the Republicans arguably stole the previous seat and are rushing this one through. And the news today was Biden, I guess, has floated this idea of establishing a panel to consider it. It's also interesting that there was a Reagan appointee who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times suggesting an openness to this, given the series of historical events over the last few years. There might be a case for it, and it seems to me that the issue is not resolved. So it's something to look out for if Biden and Democrats win handily.
Okay, I believe we have a little question from Jerry Bayer, who's the director of CSDI, and he's going to also close out the session. So take it away, Jerry.
Yeah, I don't think there's time for another question, although I'm very happy to Dick for raising the commerce power and the federalism decisions. So the Supreme Court will be important again. No one said that, so thank you for acknowledging that. So I just want to thank our panelists for this wonderful session. I think all the people who joined us have had a great time. I also want to thank the people behind the scenes, Rebecca, Tina, and Catalina, and others who put this together, putting it all together, getting it out there for an audience to be able to see it. So CSDI has a series of these coming up. So we have 4 more, 1 more before the election and 3 after. So I encourage you to stay tuned because there's lots of developments to come, and we'll be here for you to help you see through some of what's going on with a great kind of panelists just like today. So thank you everybody very much for joining us today, and we'll hope to see you again on some of our other panels. Go to democracy.arts.ubc.ca and you can see them all. Thank you everyone.
Thank you. And watch the debate tonight if you're a junkie.